And a very good evening to you. Good night to some of you. Good afternoon to those of you who are in the on the west coast of the United States. It's still afternoon here. Those of you joining us from California, and those of you who are joining us from Arizona, where I am hanging out. Welcome to Politics 101. Welcome to Politics 101. It's Friday, and as you know, all week we're covering that special forum on people of African descent in Geneva, Switzerland, and we have been covering that forum. From Tuesday, we heard from three of the participants, Vincent Alexander, sorry. Vincent Adams is usually with us on Fridays, but today we are concentrating on the meeting in Geneva. So we had Vincent Alexander on Tuesday, Nigel Hughes on Wednesday, and yesterday afternoon, last night, we had young Darren Wade. Today, we are going to have the fourth member of that delegation, Sister Olive Sampson. She will be joined by Vincent and Nigel. So please share the link, let everyone know that we're on. We should be a little bit bouncy this evening, because we come on air with some good news. Some good news for those of us who supported the teachers' strike. Let me read what is here in the news. In a major victory for the GTU, Justice Sandel Kisuna's rule that the teachers' strike over the absence of collective bargaining was legal and justified. The judge today delivered a lengthy ruling this morning in which he said that where there is the legitimate right to strike, when invoked, this does not equate to no work, no pay. Let me repeat that. The judge today delivered a lengthy ruling in which he said that where there is the legitimate right to strike, when invoked, this does not equate to no work, no pay. The Guyanese Teachers Union had gone to court to challenge the government's decision to deduct pay from striking teachers and the government's intention to cease deduction of the dues from teachers' pay in favor of the union. Regarding the government's intent to cease deduction, Justice Kissoon said he found the decision unconstitutional. Such a decision is grounded in bad faith and has to be struck down, he said. In his ruling, the judge also said that the CEO, Saddam Hussein, was not frank with the court, and this testimony could not be relied upon. He said that the CEO was asked to produce evidence to support allegations made by the state, but none was provided. You always hear the lawyers always tell you, don't get the court vexed. The judge also criticized the chief labor officer. He said that the failure by the chief labor officer to intervene contributed to strike action. The judge added that the consensus appears to have been that teachers must accept the imposition of wage increases. There we have it, sisters and brothers. Those of us who have continued to follow that story. Serious implications for the collective bargaining in Guyana, I dare say. Last night, a number of teachers contacted me to say, Dr. Hines, please tell us what's going to happen tomorrow. And I couldn't help but bemoan the lack of faith our people have come to have in our institutions, through no fault of them. But they were nervous. And, I was almost certain that the ruling was going to go this way. I couldn't see the ruling going in another way, even in Guyana. And I did say to them I thought the ruling would come down in favor of the teachers union. I convinced a couple of them. I didn't convince all of them. And I know the couple that I convinced by this morning, when they woke up, they weren't convinced anymore. It's the way in which our people have lacked faith in our institutions, thanks to the way this government has maneuvered, brought a lot of the institutions into disrepute, and so forth. But I think all the teachers are happy this evening, insofar as that one can be happy with the situation. This is seen as a far-reaching decision by the courts. Of course, the government is likely to appeal. And so it's going to drag the matter out somewhat. But the teachers already have instructed their union to seek mediation and arbitration. If the government doesn't want to go in that direction, then to go on strike, and not to resume work until the matter is fully settled. They're also instructed to go to court, again. And they were awaiting this ruling today. Good evening to all of you. Good evening to all the Bookers. Good evening to all the Bens. Good evening to all of you, wherever you're joining us from. It's always good when you win some things. When you're in a struggle on the opposition side, it's not easy. You don't have the power of state behind you to distribute things to people and so on. So you rely on these victories, and we have to call them that. I had withdrawn the word victory because some people felt the first round the teachers had lost. I was not of that view. I felt the teachers, from the time they set foot on the streets and they withdrew the labor, they began to win. But yes, I understand some people were reticent about that. So here is the ruling today by the court, and I think it's good. For me, the most important aspect of that ruling is the indictment of the chief labor officer. I think that is instructive, because had the chief labor officer done what all labor officers should do, and many of them have done it in the past, was to move to conciliation and then arbitration. It's constitutional, and there we have the branch that is mandated to settle disputes, even dispute within the other two branches of government. In a sense, what the court is telling the chief labor officer, you did not carry out your duties under the Constitution. For me, as a political person, as a lay person, that is instructive. All right, so tonight we're going to continue our conversation. We're going to continue our conversation on what is happening there in Geneva. We already notice that the government is reacting as they usually do whenever they're confronted with what Vincent Alexander, in a letter today, said the government went to Geneva. The government went to Geneva with propaganda rather than facts. With propaganda rather than facts in his letter today. And, there's always been this thing that they call on the opposition side. Produce the evidence. And some of us were a little bit flippant about it because we were saying the evidence is there. And Vincent Alexander actually, Nigel Hughes actually took them up and began the job of getting us in the business of producing the evidence. And now, when provided with the evidence in Geneva, they're jumping all over the place. They're jumping all over the place. We're going to start off this evening with the presentation by Sister Olive Sampson, the CEO of Ipadagy, in a fiery presentation, as we say in our language, our political language, a fiery presentation. So let's listen to Sister Olive, and then we're going to bring in the other members of the delegation, the two of them. Brother Darren is not here tonight, but Brother Nigel and Brother Vincent are here. So please share the link. Remember, we are saying these shows should be seen and heard, as widely as we can share them, especially for our younger people. We're doing it on Politics 101 on a Friday night. Friday night is a special night in our Guyanese community, the end of the official work week. And boy, is the time when the aroma, the smell of the vendors doing their thing, well, I don't have to tell you all what is in the old-time glass case. I guess I don't do the glass case thing anymore. But it's Friday night. It's Friday night. Let's go. We're going to listen to Sister Olive Sampson first, and then we're going to have the discussion.
International Decade for People of African Descent, Guyana.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I speak today on behalf of the International Decade for the People of African Descent, Assembly Guyana. We call for the second decade as necessary for our survival in Guyana. Funding is critical and should come directly from the UN and its agencies. Organizations working towards fulfilling the goals of the decade should not be subject to the whims and fancies of governments who only pay lip service to its goals. The current government of Guyana never articulated a plan or instituted a policy, nor did it promote any dedicated program for the decade. As evidence of the government's disregard for the decade, it has arbitrarily and vindictively suspended funding for Ipadagy, a community-based institution focused on the goals of the decade. It instead offered cash grants to some Ipadagy member organizations, sidestepping the overarching transformative purpose of the decade while mimicking the colonial divide and rule strategy. Instead of pursuing the goals of the decade, the government of Guyana has chosen to preside over the increased oppression and marginalization of African Guyanese through extrajudicial killings, bulldozing and demolition of homes and businesses, displacement of African Guyanese from their communities, and land grabs and other atrocities. In lieu of the preservation and teaching of our history and culture, we have witnessed their suppression and the imposition of a demoralizing, contrived narrative such as the road Guyana has traversed, submitted by the government in response to UN special communications on the marginalization of African Guyanese. Instead of economic development, we have seen poverty wages for the majority of African descendant public service, refusal to negotiate with their unions, discrimination in contracting. Most African Guyanese are experiencing rising poverty in Guyana's booming oil economy. In this new decade, people of African descent must be protected by declaration on the promotion, protection, and full respect of the human rights of people of African descent. For example, the persistent and continuing sexual abuse and harassment of African Guyanese women by high-ranking male ministers of government in their official capacities in parliament must cease. The protective mantle of the second decade is urgently needed to save the African Guyanese community.
Oh, and you heard it there. You heard it. you heard it there, the response to the presentation by the CEO of IPADG. Well, we have the full panel here: Vincent, Nigel, and the sister Olive. Good evening, and welcome to Politics 101.
Good night, David.
evening.
Well, good morning where you all are.
Yes, indeed.
Good morning where Olive and Nigel are. Let's start with you, Olive. You made the presentation, and we heard the response there in the background to that presentation. Saying as much as you did in 2 minutes, but yet capturing the breadth of the experience of African Guyanese, I think was phenomenal. First of all, as you made the presentation there, what you wanted particularly to leave with that audience there in Geneva, but the world, which obviously have been tuning in to the forum.
Good evening again, David, and Nigel and Vincent, and to the audience. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about the recently concluded permanent forum. And as you said, my presentation yesterday, which was a joint effort of IPADG's team in sort of crafting that and identifying the issues that were important. For us, what was important was to use this very valuable opportunity in the presence of persons, all of whom would have come together, and there were 1,500 organizations represented there, individuals from various organizations represented there. And all of us focused on the very same issue, and that is the question of the true freedom, the true respect, and achieving the goals of the decade, and in the specific case of yesterday's presentation, making the case for a second decade. And in order to make that case for Guyana, one had to lay out what is the status quo of the African Guyanese community, hence that comprehensive and not entirely inclusive list of issues that we are confronting. And so that was the approach that we took to that presentation, to make sure that we touched on things that were truly troubling, and that most of which we had reported to the UN before, but no one would have known that. As we respond to calls for input for various reports, we have submitted reports on various things, extrajudicial killings, etc. But this was an opportunity to lay it out not only to those 1,500 persons in the room, but also to the Permanent Forum representatives and other UN bodies that had representatives in the room, other governments who had representatives in the room, other institutions that were present, and to have the record established. And it's there. It is there, and it's irrefutable because there's evidence of all of the things that we stated.
Nigel, I want to bring you in here because I had the opportunity to be on the same stage with you when you initially made this public call to start collecting what you said in those days was the data. And then the word evidence came into our lexicon. And as you experience the forum and the presentations made by IPADG, including one by yourself, are you satisfied that we have come some way in meeting that requirement that you, in a sense, threw down to us a couple of years ago?
Good evening, David. Again, thank you so much for having me on. I want to, if you just give me 10 seconds, I'd like to commend Olive and excellent presentation today, extremely well articulated, and I think it hammered home to the extent we saw the response by the minister. To come to that question, it's a call for disaggregated data, and one of the things I think that we've overlooked is that when the decade started, one of the obligations of the state was to collect disaggregated data, analyze it, but more importantly, publish it. And none of that has happened nothing in that regard has happened in relation to Guyana. Insofar as how far we've come, I really do have to applaud the efforts of Epology because, and of course yourself, because this has now come center stage and forefront in the public discourse about the experience of African Guyanese. Before, the discussion of African Guyanese and their difficulties was either sidelined, overlooked, or never thought as important. So I certainly think we have succeeded in bringing this to the attention of the international audience, and they now are aware, not only from our presentation, but from the hostility of the government's reaction to our presentation, that there is a real problem with the treatment of African Guyanese in Guyana.
There is a real problem, Vincent. There's some little feedback there from you, but I suppose you're fixing it. But I want to bring you in, Vincent, because you published a letter in today's paper that I reference in the introduction, that the government took propaganda, not facts, to the forum. And I thought that that was an interesting observation, since it was the government who, which not too long ago, was all over its detractors saying, you all are going to international fora and you all are not carrying facts. You all are going there and telling the people here saying lies. And here it is. You seem to be saying to them that it's you who are guilty of not taking facts, not taking the disaggregated data to these international fora. Vincent.
David, the work of the United Nations Permanent Forum for the People of African Descent is centered around reporting on the state of things and making recommendations. That's what it's centered around. This work for us, in some regards, started with the first meeting of the group of experts. Epology attended, the government did not. It continued with the first session of the forum. Epology attended, the government did not. It further continued with the second session of the forum. The government attended. What we saw, in fact, is that in the first gathering and the second gathering, the government had no interest, and attended the third gathering because they realized that we were attending the gatherings and attended merely to try to discredit what we were saying. They couldn't do otherwise for the simple reason that if it is a reporting session, they have not engaged in any dedicated program for the decade, then there's nothing to report on. And if it is a session for recommendations, they're of the view that everything is hunky-dory with the people of African descent, and there is no need for dedicated action in response to the mandate of the decade, then there are no recommendations. So really the government's interests have nothing to do with what is required in terms of attending the forum, which is to report and to make recommendations. They simply went to defend themselves in a situation where what they have done is indefensible. And therefore, all they could resort to, in fact, is propaganda and personalization of things. So we saw not only them saying things about ecology, which could be considered personalization, but they even said things about individuals. They had things to say about Attorney at Law, sorry, Nigel. They had things to say uh, about other members of our delegation, whether they said it on the floor or otherwise. They had nothing to report. They made no recommendations and continued what the government is good at, propagandizing and being outright untruthful in what they presented. So, for example, we know that Jagdeo accused us some time ago of spending 40% on salaries. The minister accuses us of spending 80% on salaries. We know that their audit said that we had clean hands. They found no irregularities, no unaccountability, no funds unaccounted for. The minister said that there were funds not accounted for. So they resorted to a whole pack of lies. And what we saw was them attempting to paint us into a political corner as if we were an outreach of the People's National Congress or the APNU, when in fact we represent 78 organizations, with them saying that our numbers had dwindled, when in fact our numbers have increased over time, and increased particularly since subvention has been withdrawn. With them showing that there is no evidence of us being able to reach out to the people of African descent, when in fact our strategic plan represents the collective will of the people of African descent, and we have implemented activities, and our staff, to whom we paid admittedly 40%, were staff employed to work with and to present services to the people. And in that regard, we were delivering to the people. So they were engaged in what they are best known for, propaganda. And they worked with the machinery. They worked with Nia Suban. Nodo Wedi represented the ERC, which shouldn't be represented in such a forum. They're supposed to be arbiters in these situations. He seemed to be representing the ANC because they arranged direct programs to be aired on on NCN, sorry,
NCN.
on NCN in response to the activities that were occurring every day. They had programs on NCN. And you know what I observed? Some things they were ignorant about. They didn't understand what Ipadaji means, didn't understand what Ipad means. And when the minister appeared in the first NCN program, she said exactly what had been said on a blog by someone on Village Voice, demonstrating a lack of understanding of Ipadaji as a country coordinating body for the decade, as opposed to IPAD, which is a declared period of time. They call it an event. And then they said that IPADG sought to hijack the event so that we became the event. The IPADG is in fact a country coordinating mechanism for the decade. And IPAD is the decade itself.
Vincent Alexander here tonight, along with Nigel Hughes and Olive Sampson. Olive Sampson, the CEO of IPAD-G, Vincent, the chair, and of course, our senior counsel attorney, the people's attorney, Mr. Nigel Hughes, is there in Geneva. I want to pose this question to all three of you. And that is for me, when the charge of discrimination is made against a government, it should not be something that is done willy-nilly, especially when you're making that charge on behalf of a major group in the society. And I know all three of you very well, and I know that you all would not make a pronouncement like that in a small gathering, much more to go in front of the world and to make that accusation. I always say when somebody tells you you're racist, conversation is over. In this instance, you all are not pointing at individuals, but you all are making a charge against a sitting government within the context of the institutions in that country. And so I guess what I am trying to get from you here to elaborate on is what is it? What is it in our political motions today that drove serious people like you who would not make these accusations lightly? What drove you all to the conclusions that you all have drawn and that you all sought to draw to the attention of the world at that forum? What has happened in the society? Governments have always been charged with discrimination, whether it's pipe talk, loose political talk, but now it's coming from serious people in a serious organization. Something must be happening. And that's where I want you all to go. Olive, I'll start with you.
I think, David, over the 4 years now of this administration being in office, they have developed a track record of actions that, if one pays close attention, favors one group over another. Those actions, even earlier, led the US government to point to the importance of inclusion. Other bodies have made the same call for equity and inclusion across the society, because they saw the very same evidence that we have seen in this period, with this track record that's building. I know that, and I'll turn to Nigel in a moment, but the point is that, I recall Brother Kadaki, and the audience will remember him making the comparison between the roads in one village and in the neighboring village, right? When we look at the demolition of homes, we look at whose communities are being developed and whose communities are being destroyed. Right? We look at the whole question of contracts. Across the board, it is clear that people of African descent are not getting a fair deal. They're not being treated fairly. And with every passing day, the record of this government stands before us. And one of the things that we feel, I'm speaking for the institution of IPADG, that it is our responsibility, particularly within this space that the United Nations and all member states created, the International Decade for People of African Descent, to make the case for our people. We cannot stand by in this time and allow people of African descent to be marginalized and to be discriminated against in this way. And so all that we relied on were the actions of the government. What has the government done? What is their performance? And any assessment would quickly bring in the observers to the conclusion that clearly the United States government did as well.
Nigel?
Okay, I would like to go back even beyond the commencement of this administration. Between 1992 and 2024, that's 32 years of government. Only 5 of those years have been under any administration other than the People's Progressive Party. That means that only 16% of that period has any other government been in office. And of the 5 years that the APNU AFC were in government, 3 were effective because after the no confidence vote, they were unable to do anything other than manage the country until the next election. So it really effectively is 3 out of 32 years, which is about 10% of the time. If you look at the transfer of state assets from the state to all the ethnic groups, you will find that 85 to 90% of those assets have been transferred to one ethnic group. Last year, when the Economy and Justice was published, that dealt with a very small sector of the economy. And normally, after you publish information like that, which was never refuted on the basis of accuracy, you would expect a government to undertake policies to begin to address the imbalance that was disclosed by that data. In none of the areas in that program, of the 6 licenses for the export of gold, 5 remain in Indian hands. If you go to the quarry licenses, again, less than 18% are in the hands of Africans. The rest are in the hands of one ethnic group. There's been no change in the health distribution of contracts, and that's just at that level. When we come to health, education, there has been no policy in place, no change in the fortunes of the African Guyanese. The decade which the minister, Ms. Waldron, was so bold in saying that they want to go ahead, they want to support the second decade, sorry. The basic obligations of Guyana as a state to the decade have not been met at all. And as Vincent said, or reminded us, I should say, no report has come from the government about what they have done for the decade. One would have thought that they would have gone to this forum and said, look, this is the data, this is the baseline, this is what we've done. All they went to say is, our constitution says no discrimination, and we don't discriminate. So I'm happy that the discussion that is going to follow our appearance here this year will begin to become a little bit more scientific so that we are not distracted by platitudes, but that we can start to look at the hard data, and we wouldn't wait for the government to produce its data. We, and I don't speak as an elected member of Epadagy. I have had the privilege of representing them here, but I think the African Guyanese community is going to embark upon a project in which it will gather its own data for presentation, not only to the decade, but to various other international bodies, so we can say that this is the objective data that we have gathered, this is the methodology that we have used, you can examine it, and this is the evidence of the continued discrimination against African Guyanese citizens.
Vincent Alexander,
David,
yes, go ahead.
in responding, allow me first of all to do what I should have done at the very inception. To express Epadagy's gratitude to Olive, Nigel, and young attorney
Darren,
for attending this forum and representing the people of African descent. Let me emphasize that whilst we have been accused of receiving monies and squandering and spending on ourselves, Epadagy has not gotten a cent since September 2022. And here is it. We've been able to have 3 persons represent us at a place where it would have cost no less than approximately $1 million for each of them to be present. And we cannot be accused of spending the government funds. there must be a certain level of commitment, a certain level of mobilization that allows us to continue this work in the face of the scandalous approach of government to our being and to our existence. And so I'd like to extend our appreciation to our colleagues for their effort and for their contribution to the cause. And even tonight, it's a contribution to the cause. We're in 3 different time zones. You're somewhere in the afternoon, I'm somewhere in the evening, and they're somewhere next morning. It's all an evidence of commitment. Coming to your question specifically, Nigel, I have in my possession the resolution adopted by the General Assembly on the 18th of November 2014. And I want to read what it says under activities to be conducted during the national decade. It says states, and this refers to actions of the government, should take concrete and practical steps through the adoption and effective implementation of national and international legal frameworks, policies, and programs to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance faced by the people of African descent, taking into account the particular situation of women, girls, young males, by inter alia, the activities described below. So we start off from the position that the government had a responsibility to make a determination of any of these things: racial discrimination, racism, xenophobia, intolerance, etc. And upon making that determination, to take actions to mitigate those things. What we saw instead is no action being taken, no determination being made, and in fact, the argument put forward by the government is that these issues are not pertinent to Guyana. Once we got into our post-emancipation period, all of the ethnic groups are equal. We're all in the same level, all enjoying the same opportunities and privileges. And therefore, there's no need to separate out the people of African descent in Guyana for equitable or special attention. That's the attitude of the government. But all of us who live in Guyana know what the need is. At Padaji, when there was the flood and the government declared flood relief, got complaints from people at large, and the people of African descent in particular, that the communities were not being served with flood relief. That's the complaint we received. In response to that complaint, we mounted a project to enumerate the people who had not been served. And we came up with over 4,000 persons who had not been served. So when we talk about discrimination, we are talking from an evidential perspective. We documented 4,000 persons and made a submission to the Ministry of Agriculture in that regard. That submission was acknowledged insofar as in the parliamentary debate in 2022 for the 2023 budget, Minister of Agriculture waived the document to show that I had in fact written to him and he had been responsive on the question of the exercise which I have referred to. But yet we are said not to be doing anything to the people's interests. But we were able to present information so that we, having formed the Padaji, are conscious of what the decade entails. And I've just read to you and the audience what the decade entails. And we've operated within that frame. And within that frame, I've given you an example of but one instance where we collected information that clearly showed a certain set of people who are being discriminated against in terms of flood relief. And this was an instance where the government, through its machinery, was discriminated. And we can bring many more examples of discrimination, including the way Ipadaji itself has been treated. Discrimination comes in the form of us asking the government to have a conversation on the question of the decade. And 4 to 5 requests have not been honored. But we hear about the government calling other people to talk to them. And we hear about some organizations surfacing and disappearing. And the government turns up at to make presentations claiming them to be organizations for the people of African descent. So we have evidence of real discrimination. I have avoided through all of this being personal and to bring to the fore my own personal experience of discrimination in the sphere of employment, where it was not a question of seeking employment, it's a question of being dismissed from employment through an agency other than the government itself, which was instructed to act against me. So we are very, very evidential, and we are driven by the objectives of the decade. We are committed to those objectives. It's those objectives that allowed us to understand and to see and to evidence discrimination, which now informs the work that we are doing. We did not seek to have an adversarial relationship with the government. We sought to have a relationship of advocacy and collaboration, as in the instance of the flood relief. It is the government that responded adversarially. And having done that, then attempts to say that we are political. Our last request to speak with the government was 3 weeks ago when I said to the president, let's speak. When I wrote him the previous letter, I said to him, a crisis is upon us. Let's see how we can deal with this crisis. No response. Absolutely no response. What we see, even in the terms of the offer to give project funds to our organization, even in that regard, they did not invite Coffee. They excluded Coffee 250. And you know the issue that they would have had with Coffee 250 and its forum 2 years ago. They excluded Coffee 250. See, they're seeking to divide and rule. And they discriminate even in the instance when they're dealing with the African Guyanese community. We are driven by
the African Guyanese
the
community.
decade and our experience.
Vincent Alexander here tonight. In case you're just joining us, we continue our discussion on the ongoing, I think it finished today, International Forum on People of African Descent, sponsored by the United Nations. A historical footnote. You know, this is not the first time we've gone to the United Nations about discrimination in Guyana. As early as I think it was in 1962, Dr. Dragon sent a petition to the United Nations arguing that Indian Guyanese were being treated as second-class citizens, and AUC Guyana sent a counter petition called Genocide in Guyana, making the African Guyanese case. Just want to insert that historical footnote that what IPADG is recognizing is not something that they've invented. This discourse about ethnic discrimination has been going on for the life of our independent country. I want to read something, Olive, Vincent, and Nigel, from the Guyana Times, in one of its columns called The Eyewitness. And the people who authored this column, I am sure they're on the show tonight. Here's what they say. While opportunities are abounding for ordinary citizens to get a piece of the action in our new expanding economy, there are those who prefer to gripe and moan about their condition. Of course, that is a direct response to the kind of work that you guys have been doing there, in saying that you talk about conditions. Now, the political language that we used 30 years ago talked about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. That language has expanded now to talk about equality of condition. Because if you don't have equality of condition, as Nigel Hughes has been finding in his disaggregation of the data, if you don't have equality of condition, you don't even have equality of opportunity. And clearly, when you listen to Olive yesterday, that is what she zeroed in, the condition of African Guyanese. And I think, as Vincent said, there's no answer to it because they start from the situation that all is well. All of us came here seeking the good life. And all is well because our law said all is well and we don't discriminate and so on. Equality of condition is an important aspect of ensuring that there's equity and equality in a society such as ours. Please, I want all three of you to respond to that little thing there from Guyana Times, but expand on the whole notion of why the condition of African Guyanese, in fact, the condition of all ethnic groups, is an important point of departure. Olive, Nigel, and then Vincent.
Okay, thanks for that question. I think that one of the real lacuna in the government's if there's an analysis of where we are as people of African descent, I think one of the problems we have that we observe with this government is the fact that the way they approach us as African Guyanese does not take into account our history and where our starting point was and what we have had to deal with, what we have had to overcome, and therefore what is required to help us get to a place of equity in the society. Setting aside actions of government, this current government, it was revealing for us when we had filed a complaint to the working group of experts, and it went through to the special communications mechanism within the United Nations, talking about the marginalization of people of African descent and laying out examples and our concerns. The flood relief survey was one that completely well documented, and other examples of extrajudicial killings, the situation with Miss Ballers, you recall the corporal who was spat upon, and so on. So we documented a range of things and submitted those to the UN. The UN then sent a special communication to the government of Guyana. And in the response from the government, there is a very distorted narrative about our history, to which I referred in my remarks yesterday. That history that they present says to us that, upon, first of all, the most startling thing about their version of our history is that it starts in 1838. It starts in 1838 as though that is where Guyana's history began, or it is where we as people of African descent occur in Guyana. It completely negates, it ignores, it pays no attention to the 200 plus years that we were enslaved people in labor, in forced labor camps, being destroyed in every single way to build the Guyana, to build the very landscape that became an economically viable space and made so many people wealthy. We got none of that wealth. Government's report of our history negates that, ignores it. It did not happen. But it starts in 1838, emancipation and the end of apprenticeship, and says to the United Nations in this document entitled The Road We Have Traversed, that people of African descent refused low wages on the plantations, the security of wages, and they went off and they bought failed plantations. These were plantations that were abandoned because, for whatever reason, persons, the cost of labor was going up, obviously, for whatever reason. There were plantations that were not in use, and people pooled their money. Everyone knows this. Pooled their money, purchased these plantations, and brilliantly established villages. But they do acknowledge the establishment, the purchase, and the villages. But this is the point that they make. They say that we then made a very bad business decision that is at the root of our problem. And that is that we, instead of planting and exporting, we planted provision. And we just planted what we needed to eat. We had no business sense. We made a poor business decision. And that is the foundation of our problem. Whereas others came, planted rice and exported, and they showed the entrepreneurial skill, etc., and moved forward. So if that is the perspective of this government, that is their interpretation of our history, the fact that we made a poor business decision, they feel is evident from the policies or lack thereof, that there's nothing to be done. The condition of the African is as it is, because naturally they're going to suffer because of a poor business decision, and they don't have business sense. And so we find that sort of bias in their policy making, the bias in the fundamental understanding of our history and our experience, the African Guyanese experience, is the flaw in the way they have dealt with our condition, the way they have examined it, and therefore the outcome is what we see.
Nigel?
David, I'm so happy that you have afforded me this opportunity. I'm going to start with the verb in that article. They talk about griping.
Yes.
This is not griping. And I'm going to give you some examples, and then I'm going to come to the personal. Where the government gives out all the oil blocks in the productive offshore sphere before 2015, and in one case, 1 week before 2015, to only Indian people outside of foreign companies, it automatically, completely removes the capacity of the African community in the oil sector to be able at the offshore level to deal with. And let me give you practically what happens. In those offshore blocks that those Indian people got, they all went and started to trade it as an asset with foreign entities and made millions of US dollars before they even put a cent into exploration. So, in other words, they paid nothing, got the exploratory license, which is a tradable asset. They go and then enter into contracts with international oil companies. A lot of them are in those opaque jurisdictions, Jersey Island and other places, and raise 10 to 15 million US dollars for their own benefit because they hold a license. So it is the easiest form of transferring to those people government money. The license is worth millions. This is offshore. All the geological work has already been done. So when they say that we griping, we not griping. If you take that license and give it to your supporters, and you are not, there's no method, there is no criteria, nothing, and they go and trade and make millions. So they start off. If you give away 4 blocks, and each block generates 10 million each before you even get into exploration, that's $40 million already gone, US dollars, given to the other community. That's before 2015. And that's after you've been in government for what, 20 something years, 22 years. Let's go to Linden. You transfer all the high value commercial assets to NISIL, and then NISIL gives it to one ethnic group. If as you turn off of Bamia into Linden, each and every one of those sawmilling plots of land, every one of them, none of them is in the hands of either a Lindener or an African Guyanese. Linden has been sitting as a town for over a decade, sorry, over a century. How is it that you do that? If you come to banking, sorry, if you come to forestry, let's look at how those forestry licenses are distributed. And that's why disaggregated data is important. And you pick any area that you want and disaggregate the data. That's how it is. Now, let me come to the griping bit. My partner and I have been in the oil and gas business advising oil and gas people since 2008. We took a commercial decision that that's where we're going. We figured it would go. This is during the PPP regime. We invested our resources, we got trained, and as a result, we have a substantial oil and gas clientele. Every single week, bar none, my friend, every week, a client comes to us who has come to us, who has been recommended to us and says, Mr. Hughes, I'm sorry, but we are getting pressure. We cannot use your law firm. Or if they are using the law firm, they say we are getting pressure. We can't do it. I give you an example. We got retained thrice to submit bids on behalf of foreign companies who were tendering from everything from alternate energy to other projects. After this company had submitted a bid, I have the email. They came back and said, Mr. Hughes, we're really sorry. We're very happy with your services, but we are told that our prospects of success are going to be marginal unless we switch lawyers. Now, that's me. Imagine what is happening elsewhere in the profession and what is happening elsewhere in the commercial field. Let me close with this. To be able to borrow money, you have to go to the bank with security. And that security invariably is land. The rates that are 10, 12% quite often depends on your credit worthiness. One of the most prominent businessmen in this country went public on social media and said that he, with all his experience, gets 2 points higher than people who have less credit worthiness than him. If we go to and let's go to the aggregates, licenses for stone. The stone is like making gold now. It's probably, you probably make more money off of stone than you off of cocaine, because there's so many projects. Less than 15% of the permits that are given to mine stone are in the hands of African people. You just have to look at the trucks going up and down the East Bank and the ownership of the sand pits, and you will see who is getting the permits for the stone and for the sand. So to the people who say we are griping, I say just look at the data. I don't wish you to be sorry for me. I want you to look at the data, because we are not surrendering. We are saying that the way you have rigged this system, you can't turn around and say that we're griping. And I want them to publish not only the data on the companies that have got local content licenses, but what percentage of those companies have actually got contracts. And the closing one I want to leave with you is, if you take the Eccles industrial site, let us get a breakdown of how much of the land in the Eccles industrial site and how much of the land on the two sides of the Jumbie Bird Road all the way up to the Anteater, how much of that land has been allocated to persons other than the traditional supporters of the government of Guyana. And if they really want to tickle me, the commission to be able to get an acre of land on either side of that highway is $25 million. So we can have this discussion. I am willing to have it. So don't tell me I'm griping, because every single African business that you talk to in this country will say to you, that is the environment in which you operate. And if you don't stand up, or if you stand up, you will get more prosecution and you'll be targeted. The head of one of the investment agencies in this country says to our clients, switch. So please, don't let them get me started and tell me but we griping. I don't need your help.
Nigel Hughes here, and that is why you are in the right place. Right now, let me see. 1,645 of you are live here now. You're in the right place because you're getting it real. And I'm glad that you all have stayed with us on this program and continue to stay with us, because this is what we're about and this is what they don't want us. I want to shout out to my friend Ravi Dev. If you're listening, Ravi, that thing I read is from your newspaper. And I hope you got your report. This program is going to be on to cover what Nigel Hughes just said, retracting that thing in your newspaper, Brother Ravi. Ravi, you know your letters are published in Stabrook News and Kaito News, but anyone critical of the PPP can't get their letters published in your paper, the Guyana Times. So you got some work, Ravi. Vincent, the question of griping.
Griping. One of the objectives, the themes of the United Nations decade is recognition. We consider the teaching of history in our schools as essential if we are going to create an environment for self-recognition, mutual recognition, tolerance. We wrote to the Minister of Education, requesting a meeting to discuss the question of curriculum reform and comprehensive history being taught in our schools, and got no response. But Walden goes to the UN and tells people that history is taught in our schools, and there's no need for any additional work on history. Can you consider us making a request? The teaching of Guyanese history, not only for the people of African descent, Guyanese history, but using the background where we came from also as a part of the teaching. Can you consider asking for that as griping? So that's the first response I want to make on the griping question. I want to back up what Sister Olive said just by quoting, because people must understand that we are not talking at the top of our head. I have with me the document which she referred to, which is called the review overview the road Guyana has traversed. This is a document written by the government and sent to the United Nations. And two extracts from that document. Freed Africans further chose to cultivate ground provisions, which were used for self-sustenance. However, there was no export market for these crops. They did not cultivate commercial cash crops such as rice. So they're saying, as Sister Olive said, we made bad decisions. But when we called for our backlands to be given proper drainage and irrigation, is that ripen? Mustafa, Minister of Agriculture, went to Buxton and made glorious promises. What has become of those promises? Were we griping when he made the promises? The raid project in Mocha Arcadia, DB Triumph, Buxton and Itika, which was intended to deal with the irrigation and drainage of our backlands and the provision of equipment to sustain those lands in a good state, was brought to an end. Is that griping? Yet, Minister Hamilton goes to Geneva, as he did in Guyana, and says that we, the people of African descent, are our own problem because we're given opportunities and we don't take advantage of the opportunities. So we are the problem. But you know what? Lots of things are not understood as to how they occur in Guyana. The recent expose about the contract to critics forum shows you how things occur. Clearly, critic had no basis upon which the contract could be granted to him. But a number of the criteria were overlooked, and he was granted the contract. And that shows you the inside workings of what Jagbio calls due process. He tells us every day, we advertise, people applied, and people who were worthy were awarded. But it's now clear that yes, they advertised, yes, people applied, but that there are inside workings that are not disclosed, that discriminates against people who apply in favor of those to whom they want to give the contract. And you know what? No one is being held responsible for that. It is now known that this occurred. Human beings ignored, omitted to take into consideration, and more than likely connived. No one is being held responsible. All sorts of arguments about the procurement commission can't do anything about it, contract already awarded, nobody being held responsible. And I wouldn't speak about people who have been charged for improper conduct in public office. Other people who have been charged for improper conduct in public office. But there's no improper conduct here. And this is just an example of what happens. Nigel spoke about the lands along the that corridor between the bird and the jaguar. You know what's the trick with those lands? The government informs its people way in advance of the intended development of the road. The people are able to prepare to make the bid. The government then advertises the bid with a short window when others can hardly get even the documents up. And then they say, well, we advertised and who applied got. But they contrived to ensure who would get. That's what they do. They contrive to ensure who would get. And then when we say we haven't gotten, we're supposed to be griping. There is, there is orchestrated discrimination, direct and indirect, against persons who are not of a particular clan, persons who are not kith and kin, or persons who are not involved in big business. If you look at the budget, it's a big business budget. It's not a budget that caters for the ordinary people. When you look at the budget, you can see our Amerindian brothers and sisters rightfully get $9 billion. If you look at fisheries, which is populated essentially by Indians, they get 1.2 billion. If you look at the heading of it says to maintain levels of production, which again is heavily populated by Indians, they get 7 billion. If you look at agri-processing, they get 0.527 million. And then they give it Padagy 100 million, an organization. And they go and tell the United Nations that we have not delivered to our people, that we get 500 million over 5 years, and we have not delivered. What can be delivered to the African Guyanese community in a year with $100 million? When you can't even build a school, there's some guard houses being built for $100 million again. A guard house being built for $100 million. And the disrespect to African Guyanese, an absurdity that they would say, you get 500 million, 100 million a year, show us the impact on the quality of lives of the African Guyanese. It's an insult to anybody, any modicum of intellect. It is unequivocal.
Vincent
David,
Alexander. Yes,
I,
yes,
That
yes.
is,
I can go right ahead.
sorry, I think I heard Olive.
Olive is
Go,
also
go, go, go ahead.
I'll let Nigel go and then I will.
Okay.
okay. Great.
I want to come to even more important. The largest awarder of contracts, government and private, is always the government in every country. In America with the military budget, etc. But let's come to Guyana, and this is why it's even more important. Monies have to be awarded based on viable projects in which there have been feasibility studies. Otherwise, if you don't have that, it is really just an opportunity for graft to give money to somebody who is either stealing it or to your supporters. And I take the latest fiasco that is in the making. The government announced 660 million US dollars to build a 4-lane road from the Berbice Bridge to Molson Creek. You heard, this is the largest road project ever in the history of the country. Anybody who drives up the quarantine at any time will tell you there is no traffic to justify that spending. There has been no feasibility study for that. So that's $660 million. No feasibility, no justification. What you think is going to happen to that money? It is going to go to a certain set of contractors. And here's what makes it worse. The location of the Berbice Bridge shuts off 24-hour maritime traffic up and down the Berbice River because the bridge is at the mouth. So even if they were thinking of building ports, wharfs, and shore bases for their supporters in Berbice, the bridge should be moved because nobody is going to build a wharf which has to wait on the bridge to open twice or thrice a year. Make a day, sorry, not a year. Twice or thrice a day. It makes no commercial sense. So logically, from a pure commercial basis, that bridge has to be moved further south so it could release lands on the two banks of the Berbice River to build commercial wharves. But they're going to leave the bridge where it is. Nobody who seriously isn't going to invest is going to come and build a wharf south of that bridge. And they're going to spend $660 million where it doesn't make sense. If you go to the gas to shore project, I don't know how much hundreds of billions of US dollars it is, but there's no feasibility. Imagine if an American corporation, any American corporation, said that they were going to spend $1 billion on a project in which there is no feasibility. In other words, there is no economic justification. There's not even a basis on how you are going to say you are going to recover the profit. They can't take the people's money and do that without a feasibility. But we talk about a gas to shore without a feasibility, and then we want to go and borrow money from people like Exim Bank, who will not lend money if the first thing they're going to say to you, where is your feasibility? Where is the justification? We are a minuscule population. We are less than 1 million people. So who are we selling this cheap energy to justify and create an economic basis to pay back that loan? So it becomes another opportunity to squander. And if you go through every single project of that magnitude without a feasibility study, you could not even go to a lady selling in a cake shop and say, I can lend you this money. And she said, well, how are you paying back for it? But so therefore the projects have another purpose. And it's not an economic purpose. It is a basis upon which those monies can be transferred to do other things. And because of our racial divide, nobody who's seriously into business is going to put that risk and take that chance. And they're not going to criticize it because they know they're going to get victimized. But these projects make no sense. It is obvious that if you took that money, finished the road to Brazil, or started to do a feasibility on rail from Manaus to Georgetown, that makes far more sense than building a 4-lane highway between a bridge that does not have the traffic to even cover the cost of traveling, the cost of maintaining that Berbice Bridge at the moment. So we at some stage we have to get real, but it demonstrates what the purpose is, and it is not any African Guyanese or the African Guyanese community that is benefiting from any of those projects that don't have a feasibility study. Let me just close off with this person. They came and took, compulsory acquired 2.5 acres of land that has been in our family since 1858. We have traced this right back to my great-great-great-grandmother on Canal Number 1 for the gas to shore project, for which there's no feasibility, acquired the land and don't even want to pay market rates. That is how bad we are. So when they talk about griping, let's not go there.
Olive?
Yeah, thank you. Nigel, I have my own land seizure story as well. So I think across the board, we have, as people of African descent, have been suffering in so many ways. But I wanted to just sort of make the point that as we speak about business and this whole question of griping, we have so much more. I mean, the business aspect is huge. It's the economy, and it's the huge transfer of wealth from the public purse into private hands. And in the process, even attacking the small man. When we look at the nursing school in Linden, what was the policy imperative that required that that school be shut and those students at that time be dismissed and told that they were blacklisted and could apply nowhere else? When we have that, we have wages for nurses and public servants not being addressed. But on top of that, we're speaking about all of the Bangladeshi nurses that are going to come. They're going to have housing.
Tax-free.
Pardon?
Tax-free.
Tax-free, yeah, and housing, right? And we are ignoring the very people who are currently now working at wages that ought to be increased so that they can come out of poverty, working in poverty.
Can I just add to that, Olive?
Pardon?
Just add to that thing on the nurses. There is no country where people invite skilled people in and exempt them from taxes. None of the nurses that are recruited from Ghana to go and work in the UK or anywhere else are exempted from taxes.
There you have it. And then we are saying that we need welders. There's so many skills that are needed. And we're looking abroad. I have not seen a push to increase the opportunities for technical training for our young people. All right. So what we are seeing is, at the rate that this is going, we will be a Black underclass. And, I am concerned that people who currently are comfortable, quote unquote, they have a university diploma, they have a good job, they're in the middle class, upper middle class, that they might fool themselves into thinking that this will be the future of their children. I'm really here to say that we must look at Mauritius. We must look at what happened to the Black population there. The African population that is an invisible underclass. We are heading down that road so rapidly. We are being erased from our place in this society at the speed it's at warp speed. And the fact that, I am concerned that all of us need to understand that. And that in many ways, when we don't take action, we are complicit. To the degree that we don't take action, speak out, write, educate each other, we have to do something, because we are sitting back and letting others destroy us.
Sister Olive Sampson, CEO of ITPADG. Oh, wow. So much here tonight. Sister, brothers, as we close out, so we've been to Geneva. We've made the case in Geneva. The world has heard the case coming on the heels of the Human Rights Committee hearings. We could not have asked for more in such a short time in making our case, but we cannot afford to sit and wait for things to happen. As Sister Oliver just said, we cannot sit back. As you close out, what next? What next? Starting with you, Vincent, Nigel, and then we'll close out with Sister Olive.
Well, I wish to say two things about what's next. We have gone to the UN and advocated, along with others, for another decade. So in some regards, another decade is a part of what's next. The level with PADG, we are presently working among ourselves, and we'll be outreaching to the community to determine what next. So we're not going to stay from the high altar and say what next. We may have ideas, but we are in the process of engineering a bottom-up program that will in fact say what next, that is informed by our understanding of what has happened over the past decade and where we are at. So I would not run out there saying what's next. We know that we're calling for another decade. We know what the objectives are, but the what next has a lot to do with the kind of strategies and the kind of tactics we employ to get to our objectives, and we're going to engage the community in that determination. Closing off, may I also say that the Gold Project gets us an appropriation greater than the University of Guyana. I think it's now into its third year. And with that appropriation, we still cannot match our manpower with the jobs that are being created. The project clearly is not executed in a manner to allow us to match the output of the project with the demands in terms of the skilled manpower that we need. It's another instance where, to a very large extent, money is going down a hole. I don't want to say a black hole. It's going down a hole. But there is some basket at the end of that hole that's collecting the cash.
Nigel?
What next? Like everything, there's a plan. We start off, we have to have some very courageous conversations in Guyana that is based on disaggregated data about how the national patrimony resources are being distributed. We have to have that conversation. After all that information is laid before the people and we've had that conversation and it remains the same, it is evident at that point that there is no question that there is a national commitment to excluding and ostracizing certain segments of the community. And then it will be up to the society to decide how they want to deal with that. And there are a range of options that are available to them. I say no more.
I say no more. Sister Olive.
President, excuse me, as Vincent said, for Ipadagy, we will do our work in the community and hear from our member organizations across the country on where we go next, because the decade is coming to an end. There's a worldwide call for a new decade. We know that the work that we have been doing under this decade we have barely scratched a tiny portion of the surface because of the fact that it is such an enormous task. When at emancipation, when our forefathers were finally freed from the lash of the slave master, no one stopped to do any remediation, to pay anyone, to do anything. We're trying to do that now, after all of these years, to turn around the situation that we found ourselves in. And so I think that what I'd like to leave you and the audience with is the urgency of this moment, that first, even in our own homes, take the time to study our history, because we are seeing history repeated in many ways. But if you don't know the history, then you can't identify the game that's being played on you. Please study your history. Study our history as people of African descent. Remember that that our enslavement was just a small, tiny portion of the history of African people. Right? But make sure we understand how we got to where we are today, and so that we can prevent it from being repeated.
Sister Olive Sampson there, and before you all go, I just want to say in your presence and hearing, thanks to David Granger for putting this issue of the decade on the national agenda and acting on it. He was not lobbied. I cannot remember African organizations going to him to lobby. He came to Coffee 250's forum, and we did not know. We did not know. And he bemoaned the fact that the decade had gone 2 or 3 years and that we hadn't done anything, and that he challenged us to do something. And he made the announcement of the subvention of which turned out to be $100 million for us to highlight the decade. All of us were there. I remember him coming off the stage and stopping to talk with Vincent and myself, and really in schoolmasterish way said to us, well, you know, the ball is in your court. And so therefore, I wish to say thanks to President Granger for taking that initiative. We didn't lobby him. He took the initiative. We give politicians lots of licks, but sometimes we have to give them kudos, and kudos are in order for President Granger for putting this on the national agenda. Olive, Nigel, Vincent, we are so thankful that you all stop by tonight. I know Olive and Nigel, it's morning. You all got to go and get some rest. I suppose you all are traveling out shortly. And it's a long travel from Switzerland to Guyana. Thank you all for staying up so late. Vincent, as usual, you are a great resource person. We love you all. We do. Thanks. And to you, our audience, what more can I say? Go take a little relax on the weekend. Those of you who drink, take a little drink. Those of you who eat, cook something special, because you are a witnessing for our country. And it's a heavy load to carry, but we're carrying it. We have carried heavy loads before, and this one we're going to carry, and we're going to make sure that it brings dividends. We go out tonight with the teachers in mind. Victory in the courts. Victory in the courts. The government has been told by the court, you can't take out the money when the people went on strike, and that you stop the check-off system that is taking out money from the teachers for the union, you stop it. It's unconstitutional. We await the teachers' union. They have made their decision. We knew they were waiting on this ruling. Next week, we should hear some rumblings. Good night. I'll see you all on Monday. Take the weekend, like I say, and chill a little bit. Love is always at the forefront of what we do. At the forefront of what we do.
If you hear that, black is beautiful. Santa Claus. Black is beautiful. It's a textile. Lift your head like me. You got to wear